Here we go. You've gotten the history, you've gotten globalization. So now let's look at the changes in garments for men and women. As we learned so far, French fashion was really influenced, worldwide fashion was really influenced by French fashion. And, this period leading up to World War One was no different. And the turn of the century was actually marked with an exposition in Paris, much like a World's Fair, known as the Exposition Universelle. And one of the exhibit halls was solely for Parisian haute couture. And leading fashion houses of that era showed their designs. And amongst the designs shown is the image here, which is this hoop overskirt. It was known to give what's known as a lampshade effect, and the dress was normally here it's shown as a dress, but normally it'd be worn over hair and pants. And Charles Worth, who we learned last month was considered the first haute couture, had passed, and his sons took over the business. And you know, French couture just continued to grow by leaps and bounds. And between 1903 and World War One, a handful of French designers reigned supreme. So the style was gowns that were made loose and free through the body, and then skirts that were often so narrow they could barely walk in there, known as hobble skirts. The image that you see on the right is what is known of the hobble skirt. And one of the things that French couture at this time was known for was really just the use of vivid colors. And some of those vivid colors were also a derivative of the popularity of Asian styles at the time. So there was an Asian overtone that was pervasive throughout this era as well. And you know, during and after World War One, the theatrical and colorful styles of French couture became outmoded. And um, as we'll see later, the influence of French diminished slightly because they were segregated away from really the rest of the world during World War One, and the emergence of American and English designers became more prominent. By the time we get to 1900, more than 5 million women had entered the workforce. And even though most men and women still considered the women's place to be in the home, concessions to this more active life that women were leading is really evident in the styles that they wore and that they adopted. And, skirts grew a little shorter. Blouses were more widely adopted. So blouses and skirts instead of a full dress was more widely adopted. And as businesses were employing increasing number of women, clothing began to become more functional for those positions as well, and slightly mirrored what men wore in an office type environment. So the women's suit was developed. Okay. However, more affluent married women continue to see, even though she did continue to see their role as wife and mother as the most important thing, they also got out the house more than ever before. And they did that through women's clubs, and for those that had gone to college, for fraternal and sorority for Greek letter organizations. And women's clubs increased in membership to more than 1 million women by 1910. And these groups focused on self-improvement and charitable work, but they were also activists because they were also part of the suffrage movement and part of the tolerance movement that happened in the late 20s. And the suffrage movement really stepped up to campaign for women's rights. But unfortunately, um, the president at the time, Grover Cleveland, spoke for many men and women when he declared, and I quote, "Sensible and responsible women do not want to vote. The relative positions to be assumed by man and woman in working in and out of our civilization were assigned long ago by a higher intelligence than ours." So basically, God said that women shouldn't vote, which is crazy. And we know by the end of the 20th century, um, some women had the right to vote. We talked about that in the historical piece. The second decade of the century, the additional change that we saw for the role of women is women were becoming more adventurous. They drove cars. Again, they went to work, and they engaged in a variety of active sports, from biking to swimming. And the clothes required for these active competitive sports modified prevailing norms in what was acceptable with what a woman could wear, and the evolution of tennis outfits and bathing suits, especially. And as women became more and more emancipated, had more freedom, support actually grew for them. And as women gained some freedoms, they wanted more and more freedoms. And unfortunately, the one thing that did happen with World War One is it decreased activism. Um, but it dramatized the place of women in American society as they filled jobs left behind by departing soldiers. And ultimately, what happened is, of course, the soldiers came back. They came back in diminished numbers because they didn't all survive. But once women got that freedom, it was hard to put them back in the box, right? Once you open Pandora's box, it's almost impossible to put back in. So after World War One ended, the social climate in Europe and the United States had changed, and this was especially pronounced in the U.S. And the war, left people wondering whether we should have been in it at all. But like I said, with the evolution of the freedom that women had during wartime, in part because their spouses were away fighting the war, in part because they had to assume the role that spouse left behind, and in part that they worked in increasing numbers and became breadwinners and were earning their own money. Those values change. So, writers at the time spoke of the revolution in morality. If you think of, The Great Gatsby with F. Scott Fitzgerald, and until World War One, there were really standards of behavior expected of quote unquote ladies, right? So ladies weren't supposed to smoke and drink. Um, they weren't supposed to see men unchaperoned, and certainly a lady was not supposed to kiss nobody she wasn't engaged to. And all of these things influence fashion. So again, when we see a stark change in the garments that are worn in pre World War One and post World War One. So 1914 and 1920 garments are very, very different. So we can't get into the 20s without talking about Madam, Madam Coco Chanel, actually Gabrielle, Coco Chanel. She began to work as a designer before World War One, and during the war, she had a small shop, not even in Paris, in a seaside resort, making casual knit jackets, suits, and some pullover sweaters. So she really designed comfortable, practical clothes, you know, that bought, men's styling of sailor jackets and pullover sweaters in combination um, with pleated skirts. And after the war, she returned to Paris and set up a salon that really became one of the most influential in Paris, still is today. And she's really credited with making, you know, just simple classic wool jersey styles with a suntan look and costume jewelry really, really popular. One of the other things that we also see that happens is, just changes in workmanship for more ready to wear garments, and we see the structure of garments change. And this one of the techniques that we see the bias cut, that looked at the way that fabric was draped on the body. So we've talked about draping, since prehistory, right? Back to chapter one, we talked about it. But draping as a way of showing the woman's body was different, and that's part of what the bias cut did. The bias cut was just that technique for cutting clothing using the diagonal direction of a cloth, because the diagonal direction actually has greater stretch and drapes in the way that just accentuates the body. And during the 1930s, this cut was especially fashionable, and her use of fabric is compared to architecture or sculpture. So understanding just the medium of fabric and creating styles of such simplicity just by utilizing the fabric in a different way. We also see Elsa Schiaparelli, who actually was an Italian designer but worked in Paris. She created, she had a flair for the theatrical. That's what we'll say. If we look at the hat that we see here, it essentially looks like a woman's pump upside down, right? A woman's pump. But she had a flair for the theatrical, and by the end of 1930s, she was popular because she had an emphasis on color and just unusual decorative effects, and so she was widely ranged. She was widely praised for that, and she worked with artists such as Salvador Dali, who actually designed fabrics for her, and she coined the term "shocking pink," right? Shocking pink. And when the war broke out, in the Second World War broke out, she actually moved to the United States and worked here.